Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, Your Excellencies, Dr. Jeremy Weinstein, our guest speaker, ladies and gentlemen. I am Zemzem Leblouchi and I will be the MC for today's event. On behalf of Muscat Stock Exchange, I would like to extend a warm welcome to each one of you to today's edition of MSX Chairman's Dialogue. Today's event is a continuation of a series of thought-provoking dialogues which grow our horizons and provide us with the unique opportunities to learn and engage with the global leaders. Before we proceed, let's have a look at a video and see what lies in store.
We are living through a defining moment in history. Technology is no longer just a tool. It's the architect of our future. It's reshaping the way we connect, work, govern, and innovate. Yet as we unlock unprecedented possibilities, the institutions that uphold our societies must adapt or risk being left behind. This is a conversation about the future of humanity, a dialogue that explores how technological revolutions can be harnessed to empower communities, sustain democracies, and drive progress for generations to come. Technology is no longer confined to labs or boardrooms. It's in the hands of people, shaping lives from rural fields to urban skylines. But the future we're building is not just about breakthroughs in hardware or software. It's about a fundamental shift in how we, as a global community, will live, work, and collaborate. With new tools come new responsibilities. How will we ensure that these innovations empower everyone, while also protecting the values we hold dear? To guide us through this critical dialogue, we are honored to welcome Professor Jeremy Weinstein, Dean, and Don K. Price, Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. A renowned scholar and statesperson, Professor Weinstein has shaped global policies on development, democracy, and migration, leveraging his expertise in both academia and government at the highest levels. With a career spanning groundbreaking research and influential roles at the White House and the US State Department, Professor Weinstein has been at the forefront of addressing some of the world's most pressing challenges, from civil wars and political violence to the reordering of global institutions. Moderating today's conversation is Mr. Mohammed Mahfoud Al-Ardi, Chairman of the Muscat Stock Exchange. A visionary leader, Mr. Al-Ardi has been instrumental in driving Oman's economic transformation and fostering global dialogues on innovation and development. For this transformative discussion on shaping our technological future and reshaping public institutions.
Wow, can we have a huge round of applause? Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it's my honor to invite on a stage a man who needs no introduction. He sits on several boards, including the International Advisory Board of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., the Eisenhower Fellowship in Philadelphia, the World Economic Forum's Community of Chairpersons, and the Harvard Kennedy School Dean's Council. He's also an author of 3 books, Connecting to the Future, Arabs Down Under, and Arabs Unseen. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Mohammed bin Mahfoud Al-Ardi, Chairman of Muscat Stock Exchange, on stage to deliver the inaugural speech and set the stage for today's event.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, Dr. Jeremy Weinstein, our distinguished guest speaker for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. This year has highlighted the fundamental impact of major technology companies, the big tech, on global public policy. A prime example is the prominent involvement of Elon Musk during President Trump's electoral campaign and his subsequent role in the new US administration. Musk, the founder of Tesla, as you all know, SpaceX, the owner of X, is now the co-leader of the US Department of Government Efficiency. He is probably the ultimate big tech influencer in shaping US public policy. Another instance of big tech's influence is evident in international relations, with governments imposing sanctions on foreign technology companies. For example, the United States has designated this week Tencent, a leading gaming and social media company, as a Chinese military entity. Similarly, the US congressional questioning of TikTok's CEO last year further illustrate this scrutiny. Furthermore, Meta's recent decision to discontinue its fact-checking policy signals a shift in information management practices on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. The implications of these developments are profound, affecting the daily lives of millions, including each one of us here. As smartphones and connected devices have become omnipresent, they have transformed human interaction and access to information. Meanwhile, emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing are set to redefine human capability boundaries. The digitalization of our society has catalyzed the rise of big tech. The scale of their influence is unprecedented. For instance, as of November 15, 2024, the combined market capitalization of the 7 largest technology companies, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Tesla, exceeded $17 trillion. To put that in perspective, if these companies were a nation, their economic output would rank as the second largest GDP in the world, after the United States at $25.4 trillion and just above China at $14.7 trillion. Such concentrated wealth and power bring both opportunities for innovation and significant risks, as it raises concern about the potential for these entities to prioritize narrow self-interest over the broader public good. Consider the transformative potential of artificial intelligence. It can augment human decision-making, offering consistency, speed, and scalability. It also has the capacity to perpetuate bias, reinforce inequities, and operate in undesirable ways. Similarly, social media platforms can foster community, but equally capable of amplifying divisive content. This underscores the critical role of public policy in shaping the trajectory of technological development. Policymakers must navigate the intricate relationship between technology and society, balancing its transformative potential with the need to safeguard societal values. One of the key challenges in this domain is ensuring that policy and regulation keep pace with the rapid evolution of technology. Striking this balance demands a regulatory framework that is flexible and context-specific, capable of adapting to an ever-changing technological landscape. Equally important is the promotion of digital inclusion and equitable access to technology. Policymakers must address the persistent digital divide, ensuring that the technological advancement benefits everyone. This requires targeted investment in digital infrastructure, education, and skills development programs. Policymakers and public institutions must collaborate with technologists to develop innovative solutions while mitigating potential harm and ensuring responsible governance. So on that note, and to discuss some of those themes, it gives me great pleasure to introduce again Dr. Jeremy Weinstein, a leading authority on the intersection of technology and public policy. Dr. Weinstein's extensive experience includes senior roles in the US government, such as the Chief of Staff at the US Commission to the United Nations and Director for Development and Democracy on the National Security Council during President Barack Obama's administration. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeremy Weinstein to the stage.
It is such an honor and pleasure to be with you here tonight in Oman on my first visit. And I want to thank the chairman for the invitation to be with you and your excellencies and distinguished guests for participating in this conversation tonight. I'm going to share some thoughts to get the conversation started, drawing on a book that I co-wrote with colleagues called System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. And to start the conversation, I need to give you a little bit of context, because you might ask yourself, if you take a look at my bio, here is a scholar of international relations, a former foreign policy official in the US government, writing a book on technology policy. Why is it that someone who spent his career primarily thinking about geopolitics and international relations now focusing his attention on issues related to technology? And the answer really begins when I was serving in senior roles in the US government in the second term of Barack Obama's administration. And I confronted the fact that senior policymakers were governing a world being transformed by technology without the knowledge and understanding of the technological frontier that would enable them to be in a position to make judgments that serve the public interest. So when I left government at the end of 2015 and moved back to where I was teaching at that point in time, Stanford University, I was at the heart of Silicon Valley, Stanford central to the revolution in technology that all of us are experiencing. And I decided that I needed to make a pivot in my own intellectual interests, my own scholarly interests, and my own teaching portfolio to focus my attention on how, as a social scientist, as someone who thinks about philosophy and ethics and public policy, that I could contribute to, in part, shaping how technologists think about the products that they're building, but also how all of us think about the role of public institutions in shaping this process of technological change. So I joined up with two colleagues, Rob Reich, who's a political philosopher, and Mehran Sahami, who's a computer scientist. And over the course of 7 years, we began to teach computer scientists to think about the intersection of ethics and public policy and technological change. We began to work with professional engineers, and ultimately we wrote this book. And so I'll share some of the key thoughts that emerge from this book as a way of provoking your own thinking. Where I want to start is with a representation of where we find ourselves today, the relationship between technology and the societies in which we live. And I want to do so by opening with a story that helps to communicate some of the challenges that we confront. This is Joshua Browder. Joshua Browder showed up at Stanford around 2016. He was the typical Stanford undergraduate. He came to Palo Alto, California with an aspiration not only to get a bachelor's degree, but also to get access to seed funding to start up his new technology company. And like many startup founders, Joshua Browder was focused on what in Silicon Valley people call a pain point. What was the thing that he was personally struggling with that demanded the application of technology to improve people's lives? And for Joshua Browder, the answer was 100% clear. This 18-year-old, his pain point was parking tickets. Because as a high school student growing up in London, he accumulated a lot of parking tickets. He simply didn't park in the right places. He left his car in place long after it needed to be moved, and he accumulated parking tickets that he was not in a position to pay for. So he came to Stanford, and instead of focusing on his coursework, he designed an early kind of prototype of a machine learning chatbot that could help you get out of parking tickets. And he went out for venture capital funding to start a company called Do Not Pay. Now, the reason that I open up with a story about parking tickets, you may say, this is such a small issue. Why are you focusing on parking tickets? It's because I think it gives us a lens into some of the challenges that technology represents for society writ large. Because Joshua Browder, with more than $10 million of venture capital funding, was solving for his particular pain point, wanting to get out of paying for parking tickets. But he wasn't asking himself the question, why do parking tickets exist? And in London, parking tickets exist, and we all know this from the societies in which we live, for lots of different reasons. Sometimes you can't park in particular places because those spots are reserved for people who need access to a building because of their own disabilities. Sometimes you can't park in a particular space, especially in the United States in winter, because you need to clean the side of the road to preserve sewage operations and water from being able to disappear into the sewage system. Sometimes, as in the UK, you have restrictions on parking as a way of reducing congestion in the city and solving for environmental goals. And in fact, in the UK, when people pay parking tickets, it's part of what enables infrastructure investment in roads. So Josh Browder started a company to enable people to get out of parking tickets that they justifiably deserve, solving his pain point, but not in effect solving for society. Now, Joshua Browder's ambitions go well beyond parking tickets and do not pay, because in fact, Joshua Browder's ambitions are to replace the legal profession with AI chatbots. Now, I don't take this personally not only because my wife is a lawyer, but also because I think about what does the rule of law represent in society, and to what extent are we prepared to think about the application of technology in spaces that for a long time have depended on human judgment. So I start with that story, and of course, to bring us into the present moment, Do Not Pay is 2016. The present moment is large language models, and large language models as one example of artificial intelligence. And we know that large language models and generative AI are transforming so many fields in 2024. If you ask ChatGPT, will large language models take over the world? ChatGPT tells you not to worry. Everything's going to be okay. But of course, as large language models get rolled out, first from OpenAI, now from many companies all around the world, we get this quick rush to commercialize this extraordinary new technology, which I'm sure so many of you have played with. Now I think about the consequences for society of this new technology, not just the beneficial use cases, but as a parent to 2 teenage kids. One of the first things that I saw as ChatGPT was rolled out to the world was the rush to commercialize this technology. And who wanted to commercialize this technology? Companies like Paragraph AI, which promised, especially to willing young people, flawless grammar and effortless writing. 2 things that are extremely hard to pull off and that high school students would love to avoid, needing to write, right? Needing to work through the reading that's required in their literature class and to offer that analytical insight or that essay that's developed. Now, I'm not saying that ChatGPT and generative AI won't become like the calculator, but the consequence of the way that large language models were rolled out into the world is that hundreds of thousands of teachers woke up one morning and all of a sudden had to grapple with a new technology that necessarily would transform how they approach their teaching, but without the preparation to think about the implications for what they were trying to communicate. Now again, that example, that social consequence of this new technology, like parking tickets, might feel small. But as we think about generative AI writ large, one of the phrases that you might have heard is P-doom, the probability of doom. The concern that the technological leaders of this moment have that basically there are existential risks presented by this generation of technological change. That the risk of runaway AI, large language models and their successors that are in a position to act independent of human prompts. And so we have tech leaders like Sam Altman of OpenAI testifying before Congress, beginning to shape and argue for an important role of our public institutions in beginning to establish guardrails around these technologies. Now, I meet you today in Oman, and the issues that I'm presenting to you, though written about in our book from the perspective largely of the United States and Europe, are now global issues. And the question is, where is the power of public institutions going to be exercised as we think about building guardrails around these new technologies? You'd think it might happen in Washington, D.C., but Washington, D.C. has largely been absent from regulatory questions about technology until recently. Perhaps it's Beijing, perhaps it's Brussels, perhaps it's Abu Dhabi, perhaps it's here in Oman. And ultimately, a set of questions are going to need to be asked by every public institution about how we balance the opportunities and risks of new technologies, as the chairman described. Now, everyone in the world wants to be a leader in AI. This is the AI Competitiveness Index that comes out of Stanford. But what leadership means is something different from one context to another. The US and China are at the forefront of the AI Competitiveness Index, long dominant players that are seeking to preserve their status. You can see the United Kingdom, France, and Germany on this list, countries that are embedded in the European Union that have a strong orientation towards regulation, the protection of privacy, the preservation of competition, but are also looking to reboot their economies in fundamental ways to keep up with the pace of technological change. And then you can see new and emergent countries, India, United Arab Emirates, and Singapore on this list, aspirations to use this moment of technological change to transform their economies and to play on the global stage. So desires for leadership that are common, but strategies that are quite different. And then there are big questions where we see a divergence across contexts. How is it that countries should cooperate with big tech? We have the Omani Investment Authority's recent investment in Elon Musk's xAI, or Saudi Arabia's commitment of resources to invest in artificial intelligence. On the other hand, you have the European Union and the United States focused on really challenging the hegemonic and dominant position of large technology companies. So how close to cooperate and how much to try and break up these behemoths. Another set of questions are about to what extent countries should cooperate with one another in this process of technological change. I was in Abu Dhabi just yesterday and at the Technology Innovation Institute, where they've launched a new large language model, Falcon 3, that in many ways outperforms the large language models that have been generated by companies in the United States. But part of what makes this model different is that it is open source. It is available to the world. And the aspiration of Abu Dhabi is to bridge that digital divide by bringing large language models to countries that don't have the capability to develop it on their own. On the other hand, as the chairman referenced, we're at a moment where national security concerns are beginning to shape the technological landscape in important ways, the so-called chip wars, debates about who can have access to the advanced chips that are so central to building the compute power for large language models. There are questions that are being asked here in Oman and more broadly about the role of AI in improving the performance of public institutions themselves. I was with Her Excellency, the Minister of Education today, who's driving an effort to think about an AI-driven metaversity, right? Or thinking about the use of AI tools in all sorts of aspects of our public functions, including the rule of law and the preservation of order. And then perhaps at a level that takes me back to some of my roles at the State Department and the US government, what about global rules? To what extent will we be in a moment of crafting a set of global rules, forging international cooperation around the guardrails that we want to establish for new technologies? And what about the US? Where will the US play at this moment of transformational change? And the answer is we don't quite know yet. With a new president coming into power on January 20th, on the one hand, we have the attraction to the agenda of Lina Khan, who's been the central regulator in the United States, challenging the kind of lack of market competition created by dominant tech platforms. J.D. Vance, the vice president, has been an enthusiast for that agenda. On the other hand, we have a picture here of Mark Andreessen, one of the key drivers of the sector of venture capital, also an enthusiastic supporter of Donald Trump, really believes in unfettered innovation. So what direction will the US government go? How will the US government play? It's something we don't yet know. So that's where we find ourselves today. But I think to give yourself an understanding about how we might approach this moment, I need to give you some history about where we came from. Because this moment of confronting the AI revolution isn't all that different in consequential ways from prior moments of technological change, even over the last 20 years. The creation of the internet, the launch of social media platforms, and now this moment of AI. So let's take a detour for a minute and talk about where we came from. And I wanted to start with something that you may be familiar with. It's called the Tech Optimist Manifesto. It was a document that Marc Andreessen published only a couple years ago, and it speaks to the disruptive potential of technology and the belief of those who are driving this process of technological change that unfettered innovation will be the driver of societal transformation and social progress. You can see in the language this aspiration. We can advance to a far superior way of living and of being. We have the tools, the systems, and the ideas. We have the will. It's time to be techno-optimists. And a couple years ago, Marc Andreessen was trying to bring the world back from a set of concerns about the consequences of technology that all of us are living with, and to say, let's set those concerns aside and focus on how technology can transform our lives. Now that's one perspective, and that's a perspective that dates back to the earliest days of this current revolution in technology that we're living through. But there's another perspective that you need to have, and that's the perspective that comes from political economy. It's to recognize that when the market drives building on scientific innovation, a process of social transformation, it often generates what economists call externalities. Consequences for the way in which we live together in society that won't be solved for by the market, but that ultimately need to be addressed in fundamental ways by government, by our public institutions. The classic externality, of course, is pollution. You can have a factory doing a highly efficient job of producing something that we use every day, but it may be emitting something into the water or emitting something into the air. And ultimately, it's not contained in the price of the product. That's social cost. And so technology is no different than any other part of the private market. Extraordinary benefits that come from technology that will be driven by technology companies themselves, often for a commercial return, but then a set of social consequences, which you can call externalities. And ultimately, the role of public institutions will be to address those externalities in some consequential way. Now, maybe this sounds obvious to you, but one of the most important challenges of this moment of technological change is that until recently, governments have largely been out of the game. That the orientation to our successive moments of technological revolution have been ones in which the benefits have been maximized and the social consequences have gone largely unaddressed. And part of the book offers an explanation as to why we find ourselves in that situation. Extraordinary benefits, but social consequences largely unaddressed. And there are really three reasons. The first is that technology companies and even the process of building new technologies is centered around the field of computer science, rooted in a discipline of engineering that's built around a logic of optimization. And optimization builds on the extraordinary tools of mathematics, chooses an objective function, and it says what is the most efficient way to produce that outcome, and uses the power of math and of logic and ultimately of computation to optimize for that outcome. But when you approach the world with that optimization mindset, sometimes you forget to ask the question, am I optimizing for an outcome that's socially worthwhile? That's what I call the problem of bad ends or goals or objectives. Is this ultimately an outcome that serves our collective interest? And of course, Do Not Pay speaks to that challenge in a simple way. A second challenge is that in this computational context, you may have a worthwhile goal. For example, the goal that Facebook had of connecting all of us to one another. But you need to find a measurable proxy that enables you to optimize for that goal. And what was Facebook's proxy? It was the time spent on the Facebook platform. And for those of us who are parents to young kids who find themselves addicted to these new technologies, we ask ourselves the question, is time spent on the Facebook platform what we mean by being more deeply connected to one another. And then the third challenge of the optimization mindset is that in reality, we face multiple goals that are often in tension with one another. So if you take an application like Signal or WhatsApp that many of you may have on your telephones, it optimizes for privacy. But there might be reasons that perhaps for the preservation of public order, the prevention of illegal behavior, that you don't want 100% privacy and zero access to the kind of information that is passed between individuals. And so the private sector will solve for privacy, but it's left for public institutions to deal with the goals that go unaddressed. So that's the first historical challenge that gives us this moment of social consequences unaddressed, which is technology companies being driven by this optimization mindset. But you take that optimization mindset and then you combine it with the financing model of large technology companies, which is venture capital, a dramatically different way of resourcing this process of private sector development than you traditionally had in the financial system. Spreading a large amount of resources across a large number of companies and making bets on individuals. It's almost like a lottery. You're hoping that one of the portfolio companies realizes outsized returns to pay back all of your investors. And in order to do that, when you find that unicorn, the pressures to scale that company quickly, long before we understand the social consequences of the products that they're putting into market, combined with the network effects of the technologies that are being built, leads to large companies that exercise dominant positions almost overnight. And that increases the likelihood that products that have social consequences have those social consequences not for small numbers of individuals, but for societies writ large. So first challenge, optimization mindset. Second challenge, the financing model that drives a quick path to scale. And then the third is that up until recently, public institutions have largely left technology and technology companies separate from a generally standard process of building guardrails around the private market. And the view very much was to pave this pathway to the information superhighway, as President Clinton called it in the 1990s, to craft a regulatory oasis around big tech that would enable this transformation that all of us have lived through. But of course, now we're living with some of the social consequences of the optimization mindset, the venture capital model, and regulatory indifference. And the chairman mentioned some of these social consequences. Transformations in the information ecosystem, the disappearance of truth online, the inability to separate fact from fiction. Concerns about our personal data, who has access to it? Who is it sold to? How might it be used in ways that we maybe didn't give permission for? Issues of bias and discrimination when we think about large language models, when we think about machine learning models, they are predictions based on the past. And to the extent that the past encoded issues of discrimination and bias, those will be replicated in the future. And then the shocks to the labor market. What are the pathways to growth and change? What are the opportunities for meaningful work? What will enable people, whether blue-collar individuals or white-collar individuals, to realize their economic aspirations in a world disrupted by technological change? All of these are externalities. All of these are social consequences that are not solved for by the companies themselves. So that leaves the question, where do we go? Where do we go from here? A world of tremendous technological change, opportunities that are transforming the quality of our lives, but social consequences that until recently have gone largely unaddressed. So one of the key messages of the teaching that I've done, of the book that we've written, is that technology isn't something that just happens to us. It's not like when we're at the beach and we're standing in the ocean. It's not like a wave that washes over us, that we have no ability to shape or direct. In fact, all of us, the ability that we have is to shape the direction of technological change. And we can do that because we might be engineers ourselves. We might be financiers, or leaders in the C-suite of technology companies. We might be investors who are allocating capital. We might be consumers of technologies, but most importantly, all of us live in societies that are governed by public institutions that get to have a voice in the process of technological change. Now, some in the tech sector will say, well, if you don't like the impact of new technologies, just take them off your phone, right? Delete Facebook, right? Stop using it. But I hope one of the messages that you'll take away from my talk is that deleting Facebook doesn't solve for the social consequences of technological change. Because even if I don't have Facebook on my phone, I still live in a society in which Facebook is transforming the information ecosystem in which my democracy in the United States operates. So that's not good enough. In fact, we need an orientation towards far more systemic solutions. I got a picture of a highway system here, and part of the reason that I have that picture on the screen is that there was this transformative technology more than 100 years ago, which was the automobile. It changed so much about how we live, about how people relate to one another, about our ability to live apart from where we work and to connect to our families. But when we built that new technology and we rolled it out into society, we didn't encourage people to pick which side of the road they wanted to run on. We didn't say, drive as fast as you want. We didn't encourage them to stop at their own discretion. We established a set of guardrails, a set of rules that would help us use this technology to our benefit, but also to mitigate some of the costs. And that's the moment that we're at in 2024. Not just accelerating technological change to transform our economies, but thinking in concrete ways about the appropriate guardrails. Now, the work of public institutions will be fundamentally important. But my own view is that there's a race between public institutions and technological change that will always be won by technological change. That the frontiers of technology will be forged in science, will be forged in companies themselves, and that the starting place for integrating a focus on ethics and values is really in the discipline and field of computer science itself and in companies. The need to cultivate an ethic of responsibility with respect to the use of this powerful tool in the world. And if you want to contrast, think about the ethical frameworks that govern the development of new health technologies, the medicines that we take into our own bodies. Extraordinary power comes from life sciences innovation, but also extraordinary care is taken in life science innovation to make sure that those technologies that transform human health are ones that benefit us and where we understand their harms. No such framework exists for computer science. No such framework exists for machine learning. That's part of the work that I was doing as a professor at Stanford before I took this new role at Harvard. We also need to move from the work of engaging individual technologists to the work of engaging industry, and that ultimately mechanisms for self-regulation, for technology companies coordinating with one another on issues of safety, security, and trust will be at the center of efforts to govern this technological moment. The US has moved dramatically in this direction in recent years with the launch of multiple voluntary commitments frameworks with the large technology companies, as you see here. There will continue to be increasing pressure to check the dominant power of large technology companies, in part because open competition is what will enable technological change. It also will enable a technology sector that reflects the different preferences that societies and consumers will have about the kinds of products that they want to buy. And concentrated power in a small number of large companies won't enable that realization of these different preferences in the products that we use. But then as I approach the end of my talk, I want to mention two final points. That to meet this moment of technological change, the work can't be done by computer scientists and technologists alone. It can't be done by relying on technologists and the companies they lead to look out for our collective and social interests. That's work that's going to have to be done by government, whether here in Oman, in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, in Brussels, or in the United States. But ultimately, that's going to require public institutions that are capable of governing new technologies. And one of the challenges that I know we confront in the United States is that we simply don't have the technical know-how and expertise in our public institutions to ensure that our public institutions can carefully calibrate the new regulatory frameworks that are required to optimize for innovation and to address the social consequences at the same time. This headline is an effort in the United Kingdom to develop an entirely new department that can attract the talent and capability. But it's not just about human capital. It's also about designing smart and flexible regulatory frameworks that can keep pace in important ways with the technological changes that surround us. And of course, we can't do that alone. We can't do that country by country because ultimately some countries have a voice at the table, others don't. Given where companies are located, given where this pace of technological change is happening. So we are going to find ourselves in conversations about international coordination and collaboration. And we're going to need to think about bilaterally and multilaterally, what are the mechanisms to facilitate global collaboration on the guardrails. We've seen tremendous progress in the last year around issues called AI safety, a set of AI safety institutes being built around the world where testing and exploration of large language models is happening in real time. Ultimately, the pressure on us as individuals, as societies, to work together to address these harms is only going to grow. With that, I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to be with you here in Oman, for taking the time to listen to my remarks tonight. I know we'll enter a short discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeremy Weinstein, for your presentation. And now we request you to kindly take a seat on stage for an interaction with Mr. Mohammed Al-Ardi.
Well, thank you very much. That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you so much.
No wonder why you're the dean of the Kennedy School. So, a few things. I mean, I think you really explained the challenges, the opportunities, what is there. But what about, how are we going to marry globalization, AI, cross-border? Can we actually, is globalization dead, do you think, now? Or can we do something with the technology?
Yeah. So you know, Chairman, that we have a faculty member at the Kennedy School, Danny Roderick, who wrote a book in the mid-1990s called Has Globalization Gone Too Far? And Professor Roderick was well ahead of his time in raising concerns about some of the consequences of open capital flows and migration flows and trade and the ways in which public institutions were going to be challenged to address the consequences. And so I think it's natural at this moment now, as we're living with some of those consequences that were predicted almost 25 years ago, to ask that question again, is globalization dead? We're facing increasing barriers to trade, increasing barriers to the movement of people. Now with the chip wars, increasing barriers to the flow of technological change and ultimately the products that are required. And at this geopolitical moment, you've got a tension as you haven't had almost in my entire lifetime to the importance again of industrial policy, to onshoring, to building products at home, the entire supply chain from start to finish within single polities and single national economies. And so what I'd say is we don't know whether globalization is yet dead, but we do know that we are in a new moment in which industrial policy has reemerged, a new moment in which geopolitics and geopolitical tension is standing in the way of the free flow of ideas, the free flow of talent, the free flow of technological change. And we're going to be exploring what the limits are of maintaining that kind of international connectivity that has characterized the last 30 years. It is definitely facing challenges that it hasn't in more than 3 decades.
And so, Jeremy, I mean, we have a lot of people here who are involved in education, many education institutions. How do you envision the work of the Kennedy School, and how do you prepare your students to be leaders in governance, technology?
Yeah. So this is part of why I took this extraordinary opportunity to become the Dean of the Kennedy School. You know, I'd spent, as you heard in the video, my career in academia at Stanford University and then as a senior government official. And at Stanford, I was at, you know, the kind of seedbed of Silicon Valley. Most of the students that I taught were on their pathway to being technologists, to building applications like Joshua Browder, to being CEOs of technology companies or partners in venture capital firms. And I saw an important role for myself in that context of giving people a sense of how to exercise their power responsibly. It's almost like a kid coming of age and realizing they have this extraordinary power, and you're like, just be careful. Make sure you understand what it is that you're doing. But the reason to go to the Kennedy School is an extraordinary institution. You've had a long relationship with it, where its mission and ambition is to train people who are going to exercise responsibility as public leaders in the world. And ultimately, if you are preparing for a position of public leadership in 2024, it's different than it was even a decade ago in two consequential ways. One is that the process of technological change that we're experiencing is going to enable us to solve public problems in ways that were not previously imaginable. To think about harnessing these new technologies, not to produce the do not pay application, but to more efficiently deliver the services that are needed to generate the economic growth that we care about, to enable people to realize their educational aspirations, to deliver services that are high quality, whether in health or education or in infrastructure. And we need public leaders that can operate at that technological frontier. And in order to do that, you're going to need more than economics and statistics and philosophy and politics, the kind of standard ingredients and law of training people for public leadership. You're going to need people that are capable of engaging on that technological frontier. That's a revolution. It's a transformation in how we think about what it means to educate leaders. And then the partner to that, the flip side of that coin, is having that technological knowledge isn't going to be simply about solving public problems using new technologies. It's going to put our public leaders in a position to design those regulatory guardrails. And if we think we can do that with the institutions that we have now, we're kidding ourselves. So we think about, for example, I often teach a case study around autonomous vehicles. And California and Nevada and Arizona, they've all struggled as they're all test beds for autonomous vehicles. Do we give a license to the autonomous vehicle? What are the appropriate rules that would enable us to test autonomous vehicles on the road? Because you can't simply develop these technologies in the lab. You need them to interact with human beings. But I don't know if you've all been on the road where you look to your left and you're driving along the freeway and there's no one driving the other car. And your kid says to you, no one's driving that car. Do you stay next to that car or do you move a couple lanes away? Because you're concerned about whether it has the capability to navigate what it might be confronting. Now, in California, a robust regulatory framework was set in place. And so a number of the autonomous vehicle companies, they decided to move to Arizona. Because Arizona said, we're open for business. Come test your new technologies on our streets. We won't set in place any of the same constraints that California has. And so what happened is they moved to Arizona. Sadly and tragically, a pedestrian was killed within the first few months of testing the automated vehicles on the road. A number of people then chased down that autonomous vehicle and tried to crack and break its windows, right? Bringing, a perspective on what it means when people are not ready for this technological change, and ultimately a regulatory framework was set in place that looked a lot more like California. So we're in this moment where public institutions are going to be challenged like never before. Not to implement legislation once every 10 years, as is often the case in Washington, D.C., but to be in a position to design smart regulatory frameworks that enable you to test and learn. One of the sort of analogies that people use is that of a sandbox, creating sandboxes in which you can test new technologies and learn in real time and make adaptations. This is a meaningful challenge for new public institutions, and my job as dean is to make sure that those public leaders that we train, whether for the United States or Oman, right, or the European Union, are prepared to lead on these issues.
You mentioned some of the countries in the region and the way they're investing in tech and AI. What would you say Oman should do to be a leader of innovation in technology, financial sector, or other sectors?
So, I mean, I think the ingredients are becoming abundantly clear. First, investments in human capital, right? In part in Omanis, in part connecting Omanis to the scientific community that is driving these frontiers. One of the things that I saw in Abu Dhabi when I went to the Technology Innovation Institute, where Falcon 3 was launched, was the marrying of national capability and international scientific potential in research labs, large functional research labs that can also be on the frontiers of science. And that's going to depend in part on what you do in universities. It's going to depend in part on building a productive ecosystem, right, that includes capital investment, right, risk-taking venture capital investment that enables you to commercialize things that are on that technological frontier. And sometimes, and the importance of having this context locally and not just internationally, is you don't want to just buy technologies that are made elsewhere. You want to know what you're solving for in your own context. You want to be connected to the technological frontier, but designing for your own preferences and your own needs, which is why you need to develop that capability locally as well. So human capital, the scientific frontier, a robust structure for capital investment, especially early stage and risk-taking that enables commercialization. But then you have to pair that with that smart regulatory framework, right? One that doesn't embrace unfettered innovation because it's the only way to attract science or it's the only way to attract capital, but one that recognizes that social consequences are ones that need to be thought about smartly and intelligently. How do you balance that need to drive innovation with the need to solve for Oman, for your own social goals as a society? And this, I think, is the challenge that's being confronted in every regulatory context. You'll need all four of those components.
Jeremy, before I give the chance to the audience to ask questions, one last question from me. We have a lot of university students here. What would be your advice to them, those who want to study public policy and embark on public policy in this age and era?
So maybe first point of advice is don't forget about the importance of public institutions. You know, having taught at Stanford for 20 years, you know, in Silicon Valley, part of what runs in the water is a belief that the disruptive potential of technology is all we need to improve the human condition. Now, I'm fundamentally an optimist, and I do believe and have lived in a period where life expectancies are longer than ever before, where the products that we have access to have given us access to information at our fingertips that previously you had to go to the library. If you were lucky, you could find it at the library. So we are living through this period of tremendous revolution. But we need our public institutions to work as well, and ultimately the market isn't going to solve for the societies in which we live. So don't lose your passion for the important role of public institutions. That's my piece of advice number one. Number two is to recognize that if you're going to serve in important positions of public leadership, as so many of the excellencies who are here do, if you're preparing for that, you know, for 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the future, the competencies and skill sets that you're going to need are far broader than they've ever been in the past. That you can't kid yourself that you don't need to understand what's happening at the frontier of machine learning and of artificial intelligence. That you're going to need not to just be briefed by your staff on those issues, but you need to understand what is actually happening in this moment. You're going to need to do the homework, as I did when I went back to Stanford in 2016. I designed a degree program before I moved to Harvard, which was called Data Science and Social Systems. And the hypothesis behind this degree program was that two mindsets are needed to help us drive this moment of technological change. One is the engineer's mindset, and one is the social scientist mindset. The engineer's mindset, it starts with a problem, and it says, how do we use data science and computation and new technologies to solve these problems of the world? And the social scientist mindset is a hypothesis-driven mindset. It says, what is the impact of something that we build on the outcomes that we experience in the world? You need both of those mindsets. And you don't need them as separate individuals who confront one another when there's a crisis. You need them in individuals who in real time can navigate both of those frontiers. So invest in developing both of those mindsets.
Thank you. Zamzam.
Thank you, Dr. Jeremy and Mr. Mohammed Al-Ardi for your insights and that wonderful interactive session. Now we're going to open the floor to receive the question from the audience. So whoever have any question, please raise your hand to get the mic for you. As well, we request you to introduce yourself before addressing the question.
Good evening. Adil Sari, Muscat Stock Exchange. As you mentioned, technologies are evolving in lightning speed, much faster than the speed that policymakers run through. So how can lawmakers craft regulations that are relevant, stay relevant to innovations, or, as you mentioned, smart regulations?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's such an important question. And I want to go back to something that I shared, in my remarks at the outset, which is technological change is always going to operate at a breakneck pace that moves far faster than public institutions ultimately can. And so as we think about this particular moment in which we find ourselves, developing this ethic of responsibility among technologists themselves, building the kind of ethical and normative frameworks that we created in the life sciences field over more than 100 years, that is the first and most important investment that we can make, and that really depends on what happens in higher education institutions. I was at the AI University in Abu Dhabi. I was talking to your education minister here and a number of the vice chancellors, thinking about the intersection of philosophy and ethics and the humanities and the social sciences with the STEM fields has got to be at the center of building that ethical compass. Because ultimately, asking questions about what you should build and what its consequences are, that's going to need to happen in companies first and foremost. In companies themselves, among technologists, ultimately companies talking to one another in a kind of self-governing and self-regulatory framework. But as you acknowledge, that's not enough. And we have models of these regulatory sandboxes, especially in the financial services field, creating contexts in which we can literally test technological innovations in real-world settings and observe their consequences with real human behavior. What we haven't had, for example, in the United States up to this point, is an orientation towards testing and learning before we scale. Now, one of the things that you'll find in the draft AI Act from the European Union, whether you like that piece of legislation or don't, is a rooting of that legislation in something called the precautionary principle. What's really governed our approach to life sciences and health innovation, which is when technologies that potentially have dramatic social ramifications at the level of society are being contemplated, we should know a lot about them before we allow them to scale. Now, that's not true of most technologies. Most technologies aren't going to have the massive social consequences that, for example, X or Facebook have had. Most will be things that marginally improve our lives in ways that are meaningful. Those, they don't need to go through that process of testing and refinement and adaptation. But for those where we can anticipate massive social consequences, we should bring a different level of oversight. That's a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis rooted in the legislative process that has emerged in the European Union over the last number of years. Whether it's the right hypothesis for Oman or not, I don't know. It's not the hypothesis that the US is operating with. And so this interesting moment, I presented that picture of 4 different regulatory capitals, right? And the truth is that most national governments right now are their own regulatory capital. You mentioned what happened this week on content moderation. Facebook's decision to basically abandon content moderation. Well, that's going to represent a challenge for Oman. That's going to represent a challenge for Canada, which has hate speech laws on the books. If Facebook isn't going to do the work of moderating content, then whose job is it as you think about what you want these platforms to represent in your own country? That will be the work of governments, and each government is going to develop its own hypotheses about how to balance what the benefits are of these technologies with some of the social consequences.
Any more questions?
Khalid Al-Amri from the Oman Economic Association. You talked about the role of the public institutions. My question is how to strike the balance, especially in the corporate world, where the engineers, they have different perspective and goals, along with the social scientists. I guess both of them have different objectives, different ambitions, how to strike the balance, not on the public institution, but specifically at the corporate world where the profit is the motive.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So a couple answers to that question. It's a fabulous question. Jack Dorsey, who was the founder of Twitter after the 2016 election, when he was reflecting on the role of social media in democratic politics in the United States, said that one of his greatest regrets in building Twitter was that he had an insufficient number of psychologists and game theorists on their staff. They focused on building the product. They didn't focus enough on thinking about how it might interact with people, how it might generate effects socially at large. And so, the challenge inside companies in part is going to be to create repositories of human capital, right, and units. In the current moment, this is called ethical AI or responsible AI or responsible technology practices that embed in your own corporate structure an orientation towards thinking about integrity of the product, impact of the product, social consequences of the product, that enable you upstream to make design choices that potentially mitigate some of the social harms. Now, we've also seen the reality of some of that, right? The Facebook papers that were released a number of years ago by a whistleblower revealed that Facebook itself had built some of those structures in its own company that raised concerns about the addictive power of technology, that raised concerns about the consequences of the social media applications for young girls in particular, that raised questions about the consequences of Facebook for the operation of democratic politics in the United States. And so then it was at the level of the C-suite where these issues get resolved. You hear that, turning the dial in one direction is going to increase your profit margin, it's going to be satisfying to your investors. Turning it in the other direction might address or mitigate some of these social harms. So that then brings us to the role of CEOs, the role of boards, and we are at a moment where important questions are being asked about how capitalism operates, where you have models of what's called B corporations or the double bottom line, ESG, right? Orientations that go beyond the narrow Milton Friedman profit motive since the 1970s that have governed capitalism. And I don't know what those conversations look like in Oman, but I can tell you in the United States, they're at the forefront of conversations that are happening with investors and leaders in business. What is the bottom line? Is it profit alone? Does it incorporate consequences for the environment, consequences for stakeholders more broadly? Those, I think, are going to be not only conversations about the future of globalization, but conversations about the future of capitalism that will be unavoidable, and that this process of technological change is only going to accelerate.
Jeremy, thank you. We can stay the whole night here asking you and getting your incredible answers. But thank you for really doing this. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for joining us this evening.
Now, I would like to request Mr. Mohammed Al-Ardi to kindly present a token of appreciation to our guest speaker. Thank you so much, Mr. Mohammed bin Mahfouz Al-Ardi and Dr. Jeremy Winston. Ladies and gentlemen,
Can I wear it next time?
hope you enjoy this edition of MSX Chairman's Dialogue, and we promise to be back with many more sessions On behalf of Muscat Stock Exchange, I would like to express my gratitude to each one of you for attending this event. But for now, we invite all of you to kindly join us for a dinner. Thank you so much and see you again. شكرا جزيلا لكم. نراكم في جلسات قادمة والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.